Don't you guys just hate it when you bet flop and turn and then you end up on the river with a complete airball and you're thinking to yourself, man, villain is never gonna fold top pair here. So you can either sigh and give up, or you can grow a pair and jam all in like a real bluff.
Son, I would tell you this much, son. I would never have put more 3,000 with 2 tens.
Oh, here we go.
That's why they sent me. I am an expert.
A problem I've been having lately is that villains just don't pay off my huge river value bets anymore like they used to. So I thought to myself, why don't I just make a YouTube video that shows that I'm capable of making real big river bluffs too? That way I get paid off again. So here we are. Just kidding, but kinda not. So in this video I will show you a couple of big river bluffs, but I also explain the thought process behind it. Of course, we're not just interested in value betting big. We're not just interested in bluffing big. No, we're interested in betting big with a balanced range. So to understand why I would bluff big in certain spots, I need to explain why I would want to bet big with my range in general in those spots. In this video, I'm gonna build on top of 2 of my previous videos. If you've seen them or are familiar with the concept, you can just continue with this video. If you're not familiar with the concepts, then maybe it's worth first checking the other 2 videos before you continue here. So those 2 videos are, first one, the river toy game GTO explained. So classic river toy game example of nuts and air versus bluff catchers, used pretty often to explain some GTO basics. So important video to watch if you are not familiar with the concepts. If you are, we can move on to the second video, that is GTO Applied, why you should make big bets. So in the second video, I explain how in a spot that resembles the river toy game, having bigger bets, having overbets increases the EV of the polarized player. So these are 2 building blocks that are crucial to understand before we move on here. So if you haven't seen those, please check out the other videos. Otherwise, we can continue. So how I personally think of the spots and the logic and the theory behind those 2 videos is as follows. So from the first video, I remember that whenever the polarized player gets to bet his range, he wins the full pot on average. But the thing is, he can't always bet his full range. No, he's trying to stay balanced. So sometimes he gets to bet a balanced polarized range and he wins the full pot on average. Any other times he checks back and loses. So that's main lesson for me from video number 1. Video number 2 builds on top of that and goes deeper into the fact that the bet size the polarized player uses dictates how often he gets to bluff. So the bigger he gets to bet, the more bluffs he can add to his range. The more bluffs he can add to his range, the more often he gets to bet, the more often he gets to win the full pot on average. So increasing the bet size helps you bet more often, win the full pot more often on average, and thus capture a bigger share of the pot. So let that sink in. If it's not clear, think about it, ask a question in the comments. I don't know, like this is crucial, basic poker theory that doesn't matter if you want to exploit or you want to play GTO. This should be clear, big bets, add EV to your strategy in the correct spots. But okay, that is for a toy game. So how do we proceed in practice? First off, we smash like, and then we can continue by finding spots that kind of resemble this toy game. And I'll help you, I'll guide you in this process. We're gonna go over some examples here in this video, but it could become second nature to you that you're thinking, this spot might resemble this toy game, so probably it makes sense for me to bet really big here. So we're looking for spots that resemble this toy game of the polarized range of nuts and air versus the range consisting out of bluff catchers. We could also call this bluff catcher range a condensed range or a capped range, meaning they don't have this top of the range, they don't have the same nut combos that the polarized player has, but they just have a bunch of made hands that lose to strong value hands but win versus bluffs. So when in real hands looking for spots that resemble this toy game, it's never gonna be as clear and as pure as the toy game, but often you can find some spots where you have an edge in nut combos. For example, in a bottom versus big blind spot, big blind might have bottom set, might have bottom 2 pair, but the button will also have these, and the button will have top 2 pair, the button will have top set, the button will have middle set. So it's not like the big blind never has a strong hand, but it's just the fact that the button has strong hands way more often. So villain having the nuts or the practical nuts sometimes isn't stopping you. What is stopping you from making big bets is if villain has the nuts too often. So to find profitable overbet spots, we're really trying to spot these situations where there's a big gap, where one player really has a big edge in strong combos as compared to the bluff catching player, who will have some strong hands sometimes, but not often enough to deter you from making those really big bets. So in this video, I'm gonna zoom in on spots where we have an in-position preflop raiser, and the big blind will call preflop. So overbetting in the correct spots everywhere will add value to our strategy. But I think it's the most important to overbet in the correct river spots. It's also going to be the easiest to recognize the correct river spots and implement overbets into your strategy. So starting point, in my opinion, should be to find some river spots where it makes sense for you to overbet, and then you can get more used to this thought process, get more used to the spots, and maybe you can find some turn and or flops to overbet. So overbetting on the flop can certainly be a thing, but it's something I don't really do myself. Overbetting the turn is something I frequently do, and I highly encourage it if you're familiar with the strategies in general. And then overbetting the river is the one that matters the most, as I already said. And I think it's a nice entry point to get used to overbetting in the correct spots. So what are the correct spots? Well, the correct spots are those that resemble that toy game. And regardless of the exact board and the exact run out, when you're about to fire the third barrel on the river, this situation is one that's naturally gonna resemble the toy game of polarized betting range versus a range of bluff catchers. But I'll give you some extra tips to spot really good river overbetting situations. So we're trying to find spots where the preflop aggressor has a big edge in nut combos as compared to the caller. So the classic example for me is when the in-position aggressor makes the nuts on the river with a straight that out of position will just never have. So usually it goes a little something like this. In-position aggressor c-bets the flop with some backdoor draws. Out of position check calls. Then on the turn, in-position turns a gut shot or an open-ender. He barrels with his extra equity. Out of position just check calls. And then on the river, the straight completes, like the open-ender, the turned open-ender, or the turned gut shot completes on the river. And this is a combo that the big blind, the out of position player who just check called twice, will basically never have. When you have this dynamic going on, in position has a lot of incentive to make a really big bet on the river and just jam all in with those straights and maybe some other strong hands. This effect gets bigger when in position makes this straight with offsuit combos. So think about making a straight with 6-4 suited as compared to making a straight with 10-9, because button opener versus the big blind, the button has all the offsuit 10-9s and all the suited 10-9s, while he only has the 4-6-4 suited combos. So when the 10-9 makes a straight, the button has a lot more nut combos. So yeah, which this increases the barrel frequency on the river, increases this overbetting frequency. So finding those overbets is gonna matter more than finding the overbet with your suited hand that made the straight on the river. Second classic spot to find good river overbets is when there is a pre-flop range asymmetry, meaning that you as the button, you open your aces, your kings, your ace king, obviously, and the big blind is gonna 3-bet those pre-flop. So when he just calls your open, he doesn't have those hands in his range anymore. So when the board is ace king 7, for example, the button just has an edge on this board based on preflop ranges. So aces, kings, and ace king are nut hands on the flop and are gonna be nut hands on the river. So just because of this preflop edge, button is gonna have hands that want to bet big, wanna overbet, maybe wanna jam on the river. So point number 2 is preflop range asymmetry. The ace king doesn't need to be there on the flop. You can also have an ace on the flop and then a king on the turn, or an ace on the flop and a king on the river. Just having that ace king dynamic, the spot where ace king makes the nuts, really gives a big edge to the preflop aggressor, the imposition preflop opener, because he has all those ace king combos while the big blind doesn't have them. And finally, the third tip you can keep in mind to find good river overbet spots is simply the fact that check calling removes some nut combos from big blind's calling range. What I mean with this is big blind has incentive to fast play some of his strongest hands on the flop and on the turn. So that's poker simplified. Both players are just trying to make the pot bigger with their strongest hands. And some bluffs, of course. Everybody's balanced. So when big blind simply check calls twice, his range gets a bit weaker because some of his strongest hands get removed from that range because they would want to check raise. So big blind arrives with a certain range on the flop, button c-bets. Big blind will check raise some of his strongest hands and then check call with a weaker, more mate hand heavy range. So just by the act of check calling flop and check calling turn, big blind is having a more weaker and a more condensed range. Not weak as in zero equity hands, but just they're gonna be kind of bluff catch type hands instead of nutty hands. So simply this dynamic will lead us to find really good river overbet spots. So we're looking for spots where on the river big blind doesn't really improve to a lot of new strong hands. So the edge we had on earlier streets will stay on the river, and we just get to bet big because villain has a capped range. So it's not really as simple as I have the nuts, I jam. No, it's more about finding spots that resemble this river toy game and finding the correct overbets in those spots. So recognizing these situations are the spots where overbets matter the most, and thus overbetting correctly will add the most EV to your range. So I've got a couple of examples lined up. So first example here is us opening 5-3 suited on the button, get called by the big blind. Ace 7-2 is going to be a board where we go for a small c-bet on the flop, which I do. And then this king on the turn is like, bam, I get to overbet, awesome, I have the ace-king advantage, and just the fact that villain check called my small bet on the flop makes his range pretty weak. Like I said, weak not as in he doesn't have an ace, but weak as in he rarely has two pair. And then yeah, this king is just really good for our range. Classic turn overbet spot, but that's not the point of this video, but it is a classic turn overbet spot, which I'm gonna do. And then the queen on the river is basically the best card in the deck for us. So I went over the 3 tips to recognize good river overbetting spots, but those 3 tips aren't mutually exclusive. So often you will have a combination of all 3 factors at work, and that's basically what's going on here. So we have a small bet on the flop that doesn't get check raised, so villain's range is kind of weak because of that. Then we have the king on the turn, which is really good for us because of preflop range asymmetries. Then we have the queen on the river, which is also really good for us because of preflop range asymmetries. We have ace-queen suited and ace-queen off that we play like this, while the big blind will often or always 3-bet those preflop. So we have an advantage in strong hands here because of that. And then we are also the only ones who have a jack-10 that plays like this. Okay, so Modest Boy could exactly have jack-10 of clubs, but besides that, he's not gonna show up with jack-10, which is the rivered straight that I could have a ton of. So I'll c-bet jack-10 small on the flop, and then jack-10, good hand to overbet the turn with. And yeah, on this river, we hit so many nut combos. So this river is just jackpot. So I'm definitely gonna bluff my 5-3 and just jam all in with it. So which hands to bluff with? Classic tips apply. Preferably you're not gonna bluff with a hand that contains a club because of unfavorable blocker effects. If that's unclear to you, then watch a video that I'm gonna link here somewhere. But this river is so good for us that we can really afford to bluff with a lot of hands. So definitely gonna be jamming my 5 high here, and we get the fold. Next up, opening queen 7 suited in the cutoff, kind of loose. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. It's on the looser end. Okay, so on this flop, my hand wants to c-bet, and it makes sense to c-bet a bit bigger on this flop. Villain here is just gonna check call. On a board like this, he has a lot of incentive to fast play some of his stronger hands. So even though I bet bigger, him simply check calling removes some of the strongest hands in his range. And then on the 5, I'm gonna... Do I overbet here? Yeah, so I overbet here. I think that makes sense. Maybe an overbet is not necessary, but you really just want to bet big. And queen 7 seems like a nice hand to do that with. So we still have the gut shot, we still have an overcard. And then on this river, again, the logic of villain just check calling twice, but mostly him just check calling on the flop, makes us want to bet big on this river. And I think my hand with the 7 blocker is a nice one to jam with. Yeah, I think I did that. So I want to bluff with a hand that doesn't block the missed diamonds. We only have queen high. Our 7 blocks 8-7 in case he shows up with that. And we just jam. And again, we have a ton of value hands here that could play like this. Jamming with an overpair might be a bit too thin, but playing 6-5 like this as the weakest value hand is definitely fine. So yeah, overbet jamming this run out here. Next spot. Open on the button, get this flop. Variety of bet sizing options possible. You could go for a bigger bet on this flop, but I went for the small bet. Simply getting check called here again gives us an edge in nut combos because of that, and because of villain just check calling. And then the 3 on the turn is not really going to change that. It does give him a couple of stronger hands, but in general, the edge we had on the flop still persists on the turn. So this is a classic turn overbet spot, which I'm doing. And then on the river, villain could have some queen 10s, but he should fold at least some of them versus the turn overbets. He's not gonna have 10-7. So on this river, we have a nice edge coming from the edge we had on the flop and the turn. And then we have a new edge from rivered straights, queen 10 and 10-7. Those hands are gonna want to jam, I think. Not sure if all my strongest value wants to jam here, but at least we want to make a big bet. When you have this spot where the rivered straight is gonna want to bet big or want to jam, villain will want to bluff catch with hands that block this rivered straight. And then this leads you to wanting to bluff with hands that also block this rivered straight. So what that means is that in this spot, you really want to bluff with a 10, because when you're wrapping queen 10 and 10-7 for value, villain is going to want to bluff catch with a hand like jack 10 or 9-10. So if you jam with 10x, you block villain's best bluff catchers, which is also the dynamic I described in the OTB Red Baron versus Canoe hand that I'll also link somewhere, where OTB wraps a really strong hand on the river, and I described this dynamic of how he would want to bluff with hands that block the straight because of those reasons. Anyway, so yeah, I have king high. Like on the river, maybe you don't always want to bluff your king highs, but I have the king 10 and I have all these rivered straights, so I think I went for the jam. Yes, well done. But unfortunately for us, villain shows up with a hand that he wants to call with, and it is Jack 10. So the Jack 10 is a good bluff catcher for the dynamic I already described. So I overbet bluffed and villain called here, so that also happens, of course. Next hand, again button open, flat in the big blind. King queen 6, so spot where the button has a big edge because of preflop range asymmetry. Button has those kings, those queens, and the king queen advantage because big blind would 3-bet some of those, or almost all of those. Like big blind is gonna 3-bet king queen suited and probably a mixed strategy with king queen off. Both players have pocket 6s, so there's some overlap in 2-pair plus, but button really has an edge. Anyway, I go for a smallest c-bet strategy. Again, this is a board where a variety of strategies is possible. I think nowadays I think a bit differently about this board. I think this would be a half pot or a bit bigger for me as c-bet size of choice. Anyways, I went for this one back in February. Again, we have this dynamic of villains simply check calling. We have kind of a brick turn, so I would want to overbet with a lot of my range, and that's what I'm gonna do with this hand. A little warning here, there's 2 flush draws out there and a ton of open-enders and gut shots, so it is easy to be over bluffing a bit. And my hand probably is not allowed to bluff 100% on the turn, but well, let's say I rolled a bluff and I went for it. And then on the complete brick river, well, not a complete brick river, 9-7 hits a straight that only we have, but on a pretty brick river, we should be looking to make big bets, maybe jams, and preferably we don't bluff with missed clubs or missed hearts, but when there's 2 flush draws out there and they both brick on the river, then likely to find some bluffs, you will need to bluff with some kind of missed flush draw. So yes, we have a club, but well, it's hard to have a bluff that doesn't block any of the missed flush draws. So I went for a smaller overbet here. A jam would probably have been fine. And villain finds the call with queen 6. So very easy call for villain. He needs to call down with queen 6. I'm probably not having queen 6 for value here, but just the queen 6 blocks so much of my value range that he just needs to call down. And then I have one more hand that is gonna resemble the 5-3 suited hand. So opening button, getting flat by the big blind, opening, flopping the gut shot, gonna go for a small c-bet. Simply getting check called, king on the turn, boom, we are gonna overbet, definitely, which is what I do. Villain check calls, boom, queen on the river. Again, we have this king on the turn, queen on the river, best possible run out ever for the pre-flop aggressor. So we jam, I mean, simple, right? We jam, yeah, we have the 8 of hearts, which is bad for picking a good bluffing candidate, but we have a 10, which is the blocker for the Jack 10. Not like villain is gonna have Jack 10, but villain is gonna want to bluff catch with a hand like Ace 10 because it blocks the Jack 10. So if our bluffs block the Ace 10, then blah blah blah. Classic dynamic here, and we pick it up. And I think those are the examples that I had for you guys. You saw me overbetting the turn a lot, but I don't want to go into that in this video. It's really about the river overbet, but you kind of might be able to get the thought process that goes into the overbet turn reasoning, because it's kind of similar to the overbet river reasoning. But I think if you're just starting out, trying to put overbets into your game, start on the river, start on those amazing runouts where you have plenty of reasons for a nut advantage, and thus you want to make big bets. Now, this 3-barrel spot is just one of many that resembles this river toy game of nuts and air versus bluff catchers. Basically any spot where a player checks back and the next street doesn't really give him new strong hands leaves his range kind of capped. So whenever something like that occurs, you could think about maybe making a big bet. Example, button opens, big blind calls, button checks back the flop. Maybe big blind wants to overbet lead on certain turns where he is strong and the button doesn't show up with new strong hands because of that turn. Other spot, button opens, big blind calls, flop goes c-bet call, turn goes check check. Maybe big blind wants to overbet lead there on that river. Or same spot, big blind checks, button bets the river, so he goes for a bet check bet line. This is the spot where big blind could go for a huge check raise. So overbets are not just applicable when you are like the aggressor, you make an overbet. No, you could also incorporate a huge overbet in the form of a check raise. Example, again, like button opens, big blind calls, king 10-2 flop, c-bet call, king 10-2, 9 on the turn, button checks back, 4 on the river, big blind checks to button, button bets, and big blind just check jams all in. Boom, what you gonna do? So big blind is the only player who will show up with queen jack in this spot because the button wouldn't check back the turn with them. So big blind has incentive to really go for huge bets there. That should make sense by now. If it doesn't, please go back to the beginning of this video. Please go back to the previous videos I made on the topic, but just recognizing this spot, recognizing that overbets adds a lot of EV in the correct spots is what makes you a stronger poker player and will add real EV to your win rate. So I hope this is a bit of an overbet demystified with some practical examples. I really focused on the bluffs that I showed you because I want to build on my image of I'm capable of bluffing there, but it should be pretty easy to find a ton of value hands that you want to play for that line too. So it's really about recognizing the spot where you would want to overbet, and then you add both value bets and bluffs, of course, if you want to stay somewhat balanced. Now that's going to be it for this video. If you liked it, again, hit like, subscribe, share it with a friend. If you like my content, but you feel like on YouTube I don't really go in depth enough, it might be a good idea for you to check out the Upswing Lab, where you can find a ton of my content by now. I've been making videos for years. There's also other video makers, of course, so I'm not the only coach on the website. But my latest module, which is a block of in-depth theoretical content, was about overbets. So I have more than 4 hours really going in depth into overbets, also talking more about turnover bets, using solvers to show you stuff and all that good stuff. Also a lot of other in-depth theoretical content of me there. And I think by now over 60 videos of me playing and explaining, mostly on Zoom 500. So if you're into that, you can sign up with my link and support the channel that way. I think there's a 30-day money back guarantee, so I'd say it's worth checking out if you like my videos. And if you don't sign up, that's fine. YouTube is free. Please just keep enjoying my videos and just hit like or subscribe or share it with a friend and spread the word that way. Anyway, see you guys back in the next one.